So last year, I helped work on a site called Speaker, and this site is for young children to use in school to help express how they feel. Often, teachers don't know whether a child is quiet because they're just like that, or because there's something wrong. It's a very simple idea. The site is just 5 faces, and the child clicks on the face that represents how they feel. And this will help flag up to a teacher if a child is consistently unhappy. As part of the research stage, we went into schools and asked the kids to draw faces that represent the range of emotions that they feel, which we narrowed down to these 5 faces. And that's basically the design of the main screen. One of the other things that we asked while we were there was what sort of technology the kids used. And this was to help give us an idea of how many children had internet access and what sort of devices we needed to test the site on. We asked just over 100 primary school children, so that's aged between 5 and 11, and found out that most of them had internet access at home. Almost half have their own computer, about half own a mobile phone, but only 10% of these were smartphones. We also asked the children how many of them had a game console. 86% of the children said that they owned a TV console, like an Xbox, PlayStation, or Wii, and 69% said that they owned a handheld console. In particular, the Nintendo DS range seemed to be the most popular portable console amongst the younger children. It's kind of a peer pressure device. The more children who have one, the more fun it is because it can interact with other devices. So I bought a second-hand Nintendo DS to see what the experience was like. I wanted to see what design patterns it had, and whether we could learn from those to make the site more familiar to children. And it wasn't until a little while later that I realized it has a browser. And I thought this would be a perfect use case for the site, because the kids may not feel comfortable going on Speaker and sharing their feelings using a computer that they share with their family. But if they've already got one of these, it's more private, so they'd have more personal space while using it. And I was also interested in the fact that it had 2 screens, and I wanted to know what sites looked like when they display on it. So I spent some time using it, and I wrote up a blog post about what it was like. And after I wrote it, I got some comments from people saying that because they don't personally use a console browser, they don't think that anyone else does, and therefore they're safe to ignore. Or that they tried one once and the experience was so bad that they don't understand how anyone could put up with using one. But in Jason Grigsby's words, we can't predict future behavior from a current experience that sucks. I don't think it's fair to even assume current behavior from something just because we personally think it sucks. It's also important to gauge how popular console browsing is. It's also impossible to gauge how popular console browsing is just by glancing around. It would be kind of like saying, oh, I've never seen anyone on the train using a smart TV, therefore no one uses them. So I did some research. And I found this report by Ofcom. They'd asked people in the UK what devices they use to access the internet. They found that 13% of people said that they used a console to access the internet. And it's the 4th most popular device to do so after laptops, desktop computers, and phones. It's even more popular than tablets, but possibly because these were less common in 2011. Although, to be honest, this doesn't really indicate what people are doing on the internet. A lot of consoles have internet connections, so you can play games online with people. So I found another report that said that 14% of people in the UK specifically browse the web on their console, and apparently this is a year-on-year increase of 3%. Some consoles also have apps like Twitter, Facebook, Skype, and Foursquare, so there's every chance that a user may be visiting your site through a link on one of these. Also note that watching video is a really popular activity on consoles. The thing is that many consoles don't have Flash or support for the Html5 video tag. And if they do have Flash, it's often the version installed is really out of date. But there's really high demand for video content on the TV, which is why companies like YouTube have to make separate apps for each device. And this is driving device makers to support web standards. And I'll show you an example of a console that's doing just that later. So it's particularly interesting to look at which age groups are using console browsers. 20% of 16 to 24-year-olds in the UK visit websites on a console. And I imagine if they'd asked under 16s, it would have been more than 20%. In the households that own a PC, a console may be a convenient extra way to browse the internet if there's competition for the more conventional device. Ofcom also found that low-income households are more likely to have a console than a computer. In other words, this may be the only way some people can get online. Pew Internet found that kids in the US are almost as likely to go online using a console as a phone. And it makes sense, because many kids that age either don't have a phone or they don't have a contract with a data plan. And a lot of parents don't like the idea of giving kids an expensive and relatively fragile smartphone. But don't dismiss consoles as being just for kids. Ownership is quite high amongst adults as well. Interestingly, amongst adults overall, men are slightly more likely to own a TV game console, but women are slightly more likely to own a portable console. People expect to do the same things on a console as they've been doing for years on desktops and phones, like signing up for bank accounts. And consider our attitude to phones several years ago. We'd say, oh, no one would want to do that task on their phone, so let's give them a simplified experience by cutting out features that they're not likely to use. But then we learned that thousands of eBay users are buying cars on their phones every week. So let's not fall into the same trap with console browsers. The reason I find designing with console users in mind so interesting is that it helps make better sites. At the moment, we really only consider 3 forms of input, so mouse, keyboard, and most recently, touch. We barely seem to design for keyboard users these days. But consoles force us to consider a whole range of inputs that are just starting to creep in, things like gesture and voice. And it makes our designs more accessible because we have to think about D-pads and keyboard input. And we think about how a site might work not just on a very small screen, but simultaneously a very big screen. Web TV is getting more popular too, and TV consoles are a great place to start learning about this context. Basically, console browsers are the ultimate torture test. So in case you're not a gamer, here's a very quick introduction to a generic game controller. This one is a PlayStation's, but they're all very similar. Analog sticks are basically mini joysticks. Some controllers let you push in the stick as an extra button, and the D-pad is like the arrow keys on your keyboard. And the triggers, there are usually 4 of these on the back of a TV console controller. The portable consoles only have 2, and I call them bumpers on those, but I don't think that's a technical name. Game consoles have been around for decades, and looking back at what they used to be like helps show how much the early models influenced what we've got today. So in 1989, the Nintendo Game Boy came out. That was the first major handheld console. It didn't have a browser. And a few years later, the Sega Activator, which was a kind of controller that experimented with gesture, but that didn't work very well. Nor did the Nintendo Virtual Boy, which aesthetically looks like a really early version of Google Glass. Even Apple came out with a console. It's called the Bandai Pippin, and that also wasn't very successful. In 1997, a portable device came out called the Game.com, and that was the first console to have a web browser, which makes me wonder, why have we been focusing so much on the tablet experience when consoles have had browsers for over a decade? A couple of years later, the Sega Dreamcast came out with a built-in modem, and you could get the browser on a disk. Then the PlayStation 2, which had internet capabilities, but also needed a disk for the browser. And then there was this kind of hybrid phone, the Nokia N-Gage, or the Taco phone. It's kind of a phone and a gaming device, and it had a built-in browser as well. And then in 2004, the Nintendo DS and PSP, or PlayStation Portable consoles, came out. You had to get a browser cartridge for the DS. Then in 2005, the Xbox came out. That's only got a browser in recent months. In 2006, we got the PS3 and the Wii, which both have browsers. And then there was a big lull in TV consoles, but plenty of portable ones came out with browsers in the PSP and DS range. And in the past couple of years, there's been a surge in the console market. So we've got the 3DS, which has 3D capabilities, the Xperia, which is a hybrid phone and sort of handheld PlayStation-style console, and the PS Vita, which has a 3G model. And at the end of last year, Nintendo's latest TV console, the Wii U, was released. Coming out soon is the PS4. It will have a new controller with a capacitive touchpad on the front and a button on the controller that lets you share what you're playing on the web. And we've also got the Ouya, which is an open source console running Android. You might remember this. It was very successfully funded on Kickstarter. And it has a touchpad on the controller like the PS4. Firefox developers are supposedly working on a browser for the platform. The Nvidia Project Shield is a proposed sort of clamshell-style portable console with a touchscreen. It runs Android. And this is a Razer Edge. It's a tablet that can be docked into a keyboard or this gaming cradle. And we're seeing lots of devices like this, not just consoles, but tablets that can have touch or keyboard input. So consider that when you're thinking about designing the sort of tablet experience. Josh Clark suggests that we assume every screen that our websites serve is a touchscreen, which is great advice now that we're seeing laptops and desktop computers come out with touchscreens. So, for example, one of the classes in one of the schools I visited had kitted out all of the children with these sort of touchscreen notebooks. So you can use them like a laptop or flip them around and use them like a touchscreen tablet. Basically, if your site isn't already touch-friendly, you need to start making changes now. You might even want to go further and start thinking about gesture. So this is a Leap Motion, which allows any computer to have a gesture interface. It feels like a bit of a novelty at the moment, but I'm sure we'll be seeing more technology like this. The Xbox's Kinect has been out for a few years, and it recognizes voice and gesture input. And it's being used in shops as virtual dressing rooms and surgeries as a way to interact with the screen without risk of contamination. The PS3 has a similar thing called the Eye, and they're coming out with a new version for their PS4. Microsoft have a comprehensive guide for their Kinect, which you should all read because it's got some really great general tips about voice and gesture interface. And they've come up with insights from their research, like the fact that children tend to make wilder gestures than adults. Something that you might want to implement on your forms is the XWebKit speech attribute, which enables support for speech recognition on fields. At the moment, it only works in Google Chrome, but there's a bug file for it to be implemented in WebKit. If you want to play with the Kinect in your browser, you can get a browser extension called Depth.js that will talk to Kinect, or Kinect.js, which helps you make browser-based games that use the Kinect. In this example, they've made a gesture-based game of air hockey. So I made a joke in a talk a while back about how it was possible to surf the web on a Wii balance board. Turns out that's been done. And there's even a video of a guy using his feet to navigate websites. So, yeah. Even though we have high-end technology available, that also creates a market at the lower end for affordable, low-spec devices. And we're starting to see a lot of these. Like Jeremy, he wrote a blog post just the other day about getting a £30 Android tablet. And I think we put too much emphasis on supporting technology that most regular people don't have yet, like Retina quality screens, and not enough on supporting the less capable technology, because that will still be around for a long time. Yes, it's important to plan ahead and think how we're going to support Retina screens, but maybe worry about that after testing your design on a cheap, low-quality, poor contrast screen, kind of like this one. It might not be sexy, but your users will thank you for it. One extreme example of low-spec, affordable technology is the Raspberry Pi, a computer built by a UK company with the intention of teaching children about programming. It has 512 megabytes of RAM. This isn't a console, but it demonstrates how new devices are coming out all the time that have incredibly low specs. And this is the Game Stick. It runs Android, costs $79, and it's referred to by the company that made it as a portable device, which is kind of curious because it doesn't have its own screen. But you can play games anywhere that has one with an HDMI port for the stick to plug in, which I think is a really nice idea. And it's even possible to build your own game console, like Rob Hawks is doing. He's tweaked a Mac Mini to boot as like a console as possible. He's using the Gamepad API to add support for a range of controllers. It works in Chrome and some versions of Firefox, and you can try it out by plugging a controller into your computer. The game console market is shifting in response to the threat from the smartphone and tablet gaming market. Web technology is becoming increasingly relevant in the games industry, especially with the additional threat posed by all these new consoles running Android. So Nintendo have announced the Web Framework, which is a development environment based on WebKit, which works with their new console, the Wii U. It means you can use HTML5, JavaScript, and CSS to make games and apps. And the framework gives you access to the Wii U's Gamepad's controls and features like the camera and accelerometer. This is a range of the most recent portable and TV consoles from the three major players, so Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo. And all of these have browsers. And these are the ones I've tested. If you're thinking of getting consoles for testing, I'd recommend one of the newer DS models. This will demonstrate what it's like to browse on two screens. I'd also recommend getting an Xbox because of the newer IE9 browser. And it will be useful for testing a conventional controller. And also the Wii U, because that will teach you a lot about the second screen. And that should give you a decent range of inputs. So I've bought most of them secondhand. Some have been donated, and some I already owned or bought as soon as they came out. It's kind of an expensive habit, but fortunately, there aren't as many devices as there are in the mobile phone market. When I get hold of a console, I run them all through the HTML5 test and CSS test to help me compare the level of standards that they support. And I sometimes do other tests too, like acid tests. The support really varies, like the Sony PSP 1000, which has a NetFront browser. It wouldn't even run the tests. This device has very poor CSS support. Like here on the BBC weather site, sprites break. Most sites look pretty terrible, but the device is 10 years old. It's not a touchscreen, so you have to move a cursor about the screen with a little stick on the bottom of the device. The keyboard is like the one you get on phones, but it's kind of worse than that because the screen isn't a touchscreen, so you have to use a D-pad to select all the buttons. You have to buy a browser cartridge if you want to use the browser on the original Nintendo DS. The HTML5 and CSS tests wouldn't run, but it's hardly surprising as the device came out in 2003. The browser cartridge also comes with a memory expansion pack because the 4 megabytes of onboard memory isn't high enough. It was built to play games, not browse websites. This is improving as consoles get better, but remember that they're not updated as often as phones and computers. The CSS support is very low. A lot of sites would only display a linearized layout. And there's an option to disable images in the toolbar. The weight of our websites is getting bigger and bigger, and the consequence of all this extra stuff is that, as well as being slower to download, sometimes sites don't work at all on consoles. And this is because the amount of memory that consoles can allocate to the browser is very limited. So I got this error message frequently on the 3DS XL. It only came out last year. And it's not just consoles that have this problem too. I've seen this error message on web TVs as well. This advice is from Google's documentation about designing for TVs. They say that sites will load slower on TVs and consoles and on desktop machines, so it's really important to focus on optimization here. And this is why it's good to test on real devices, because you get a good sense for speed and how sluggish a site feels. To help make their sites faster, ClearLeft have introduced what they call a design budget. This forces them to consider performance with every design decision. Website optimization often feels a bit like a lost art, but it's still relevant today, even with high-speed broadband. Moving on to the DSi, this device has slightly better support. It also runs an Opera browser, which doesn't require a cartridge, but you do have to download it separately. I just wanted to show you a few of the quirks of these consoles. The DS devices come with a stylus. They have these two screens, and on most sites you get two views. So one is a zoomed out view, and the other is a zoomed in view. And you can switch these views around, so either the screen at the top is a zoomed in one, or the bottom is. And the orange rectangle shows where the bit that's zoomed in is. This is how pages look on the device when they've been optimized for small screens. So remember that only the bottom screen is touch, and it's resistive like the screen on the back of an airplane seat, rather than capacitive like a smartphone. And there's no multi-touch, so no pinch to zoom. On this device, there are no font styles like bold or italic, and text size is limited to a range, I guess, to aid readability. They actually load starting on the bottom screen so that you can click on something at the top, but in this picture, I've already started scrolling the page up. The older models, like this DSi, don't support fancy CSS like rounded corners or drop shadows, and anything with opacity makes sites extremely sluggish. Since it's an Opera browser, it supports some nice features like a date picker on relevant form fields. And the latest portable console from Nintendo does even better. So after the DSi, Nintendo switched to a NetFront browser, and this version uses WebKit as its rendering engine. The browser is installed by default, and it's accessible from the home screen. It can be used while the game is suspended in the background. This device has a stylus and 3 cameras, so there's 2 on the back for taking 3D pictures and video, and 1 on the front. Special glasses aren't needed to view things in 3D, but the device has to be held at just the right angle and distance. The depth of the effect can be adjusted using a physical slider. Only the top screen is 3D, and it's wider than the bottom one, which is a 2D resistive touchscreen. You can use the bumpers at the back to go back and forward in the browser history. D-pad changes focus between elements in the page, and of course you can use a resistive touchscreen. There are zoom icons on the touchscreen, and the X and Y buttons also zoom in and out. When you zoom in on text, the text automatically wraps to fill the screen so that you don't have to scroll horizontally to read long lines of text. And this is a really nice feature. On the XL versions, gaps appear either side of a site on the top screen because of the difference in the size of the 2 screens. You might be getting excited about the thought of using a 3D device to browse the internet, but the 3D capabilities aren't enabled for the browser. You can, however, view 3D images, but not within the page in the browser. You have to download the image first to see it in 3D. The format is .mpo. These are a combination of 2 JPEG files, so the fallback is a single JPEG. The PS Vita's browser has been updated a number of times. So last year when I tested it, it scored 58 out of 500 in the Html5 test and 32% in the CSS3 test. So it's made some really good progress. The buttons on the device are barely used at all for the browser, and it relies heavily on the touchscreen, which seems like a bit of a waste to me. Handheld consoles have wide screens rather than tall ones like a mobile phone in portrait mode. So this device's screen is 960 pixels wide. This means that many responsive websites show a big screen version of the site, even though a small screen design might be more appropriate. The back of the device has a touchpad. I really like this feature. You can't use it in the browser, but it's used in some games to prevent your thumbs getting in the way of the screen. So I noticed that the PS Vita has this strange user agent string, and I spent a long time trying to work out what Silk was. Turns out it's the browser for the Kindle Fire. User agent string sniffing is rarely helpful because it's so often inaccurate. Devices are constantly using each other's strings. So here the website thinks a Nintendo DS is a phone. Even fuzzy device detection isn't reliable. The PS Vita declares itself to be mobile, a mobile device, and a Kindle Fire tablet, while the two DS devices state that they're neither mobile nor mobile phones nor tablets, but computers. They're kind of weird outliers, but they're still important devices to consider. Device detection doesn't consider future devices. It pigeonholes, which is the same with user agent string sniffing. Having something tell you it's a game console, is that really going to help? Because as you've seen, consoles all work different ways. Some are touch, some gesture, and let's say you're going to detect that someone has a Kinect and give them a different experience based on that. You're basically making an assumption that they'd rather use that than just a simple D-pad. Back when the iPad mini came out, some people were concerned because there was no way to detect that the device is an iPad mini, so they couldn't specifically target it. But in Matt's words, making something better for some people might make it better for way more people than that. It's a much more sustainable approach to design. We can't keep making bespoke interfaces and adding breakpoints every time that Apple come up with a new device, nor should we. The device landscape is much bigger than that. Microsoft get it. They know how to design for multiple inputs because they built the Xbox. They don't need a completely different UI for each device. It works with any form of input. And that's where I think we should be focusing. I think we need to strive to make our sites not adapt to different environments, but be built by default for all those possible contexts. And that's going to be challenging, but I think that's the nature of the web. Moving on to the next TV console, Sony's PS3. This device has really disappointing browser stats. It runs a WebKit-based NetFront browser, but the actual browsing experience isn't that bad, in my opinion anyway. Some consoles take advantage of all the buttons on the controller for the browser, and this really helps. So this is the PS3's controller. It takes a while to learn all of the buttons, but it makes browsing a lot faster. The thumbsticks move the cursor and scroll the page. L1 on the upper left is a back button. R1 on the upper right is forward. Pressing the triangle brings up a menu for actions like search and bookmark, and the D-pad moves the cursor to focus between links on the page. The browser width is restricted, so it's a lot narrower than the width of the TV. And either side of the main window are other tabs, which you can switch between by pressing L2 and R2. The original Wii is interesting because of its unconventional controller. The stats aren't great, but remember, it's an old device. And at the time, it was quite impressive. Navigating with the Wiimote is really challenging. It's kind of like a laser pointer. You have to point at the link with the Wiimote and click, which is very fiddly, especially when the links are tiny and close together. The plus and minus buttons zoom in and out. And the remote also vibrates on hovering over a link. This is mildly annoying most of the time, but when you have to select letters on the on-screen keyboard, it feels like torture because you have to hold the remote steady and it keeps buzzing. When you're designing forms, consider the extra difficulty that console users experience. So the Wii has an 800 pixel wide Opera 9 browser. The height varies depending on the screen. Moving the cursor to the edge of the screen and pressing the trigger scrolls the page. One nice feature it has is that you can switch the layout to single column mode by pressing 2, and it basically forces a page to lose all layout styles, and this can make the site a lot easier to use. The Xbox recently added IE9 to their console. The stats aren't quite as good as IE9 on the desktop, but the hardware is quite old. Most of the buttons on the controller are used, and you can use the analog stick to pan, and there's something called Smart Zoom, which lets you zoom in wherever the cursor is. The Xbox's browser has 2 user agent strings. The second one is when it's pretending to be a mobile phone. To get it to do that, you check this box in the browser settings. And if sites have a mobile version, they display like this. I think they've added this option because mobile interfaces are generally easier to use on a TV than traditional desktop interfaces. But what this tells me is that we need to turn our attention to making websites just as easy to use on any device as we would for a mobile phone. You can also change a setting that forces the website to fill the screen. This often cuts off content on the sides, but I guess it's useful for watching video. The Wii U came out in November. It might look a bit like one, but the Gamepad isn't a portable console designed to be taken out like the PS Vita. The Gamepad can be used as a standalone screen with the TV switched off, as long as it's within range of the console unit. It basically piggybacks off it. Its browser is miles ahead of the other TV consoles, and it uses a lot of HTML5 features. This is Nintendo's 5th browser. Consoles aren't just for games now, they're being marketed as complete entertainment solutions. So in Nintendo's case, internet connectivity and browser functionality have gone from a nice-to-have feature in game consoles to a selling point. They even see it as a challenge to design an experience that's better than browsing on a desktop. And this is a really interesting interview with the team behind the browser, so it's well worth a read. The Gamepad has a lot of browser controls, so I counted 4 different ways to zoom. And zooming is very important on a TV console. Most websites haven't been designed for TVs, and the text is very small when you're sitting far away from the screen. So that's why it's got so many different ways to zoom. It has a wealth of detectors, including 9-axis control. There's also a camera on the front and a headphone port and speakers, with audio coming through both the TV and the Gamepad, giving a kind of surround sound feel. The Wii U's Gamepad has a nice big screen and stylus. You can use your fingers, but you have to press quite hard, and it's a very different experience to using a tablet. Notice that the resolution on the Gamepad is quite low compared to a tablet, which is kind of the same with all Nintendo's devices. Nintendo's browser team have the advantage of higher specs to play with on their new consoles, so they've got 1 GB of memory dedicated to games and 1 GB dedicated to the system, which makes it easier to support the latest standards. It scores 100% in the Asymmetric test. It supports SVG, and it supports HTML5 video. It mirrors everything that you're looking at on the Gamepad with the TV. And a key thing to bear in mind is that TV web browsing is often a group activity. Nintendo have thought about this, and they've added features to encourage that. So when you're watching a video, you click on this button to continue browsing while the video continues to stream on the TV. So now it's not mirrored, and this turns the Wii U into a presentation device. You can have up to 6 tabs open at once, and you can hide what's on the Gamepad from the TV by pressing a button that draws the curtains. Then when you're ready, you press a button to open them. When the user with the Gamepad is typing, the keyboard is hidden from the TV screen. There's just a bit of text at the top indicating what's happening on the Gamepad. You can scroll by tilting the Gamepad and pressing the back triggers, which is useful for scrolling down really long pages. Normally, scrolling is very sluggish on game consoles, but it's really smooth on the Wii U. If you're playing a game and you switch to the browser, it pauses the game in the background and asks if you want to start a search with the game's name, which is great for if you're stuck and looking for walkthroughs. The Gamepad can also be used as a simple TV remote control with basic functions such as bringing up the program guide, adjusting volume, and changing the channel. I found the simplified interface much more usable than my regular remote control. Navigating a site using a console's D-pad demonstrates why focus styles are so important. The Wii U adds its own default blue outline, but an event apart highlight the text that's focused, making it even clearer. Same with gov.uk. If you're playing games with friends who don't have a gamepad, they can play a different role with the Wiimote. So, for example, in an action game, the people with the Wiimotes can use their controllers as swords, while the person with the gamepad uses spells that they can select on the screen. And this is called asymmetric gameplay. And this idea is brought into the browser. So only one gamepad can be used to control it, but if there are Wiimotes connected, they can be used as pointers. This doesn't let the user do anything except point. They each get a little hand icon with a number on it displayed on the screen. But it's kind of interesting that multiple people can be interacting with a site at once, and it's not something I've seen other browsers do. So the main thing that testing console browsers has taught me is that considering them at the design stage helps make more future-proof websites. My first thought when testing TV consoles was, hey, TV screens are really big, so I could fit like 6 columns onto that. But that doesn't take into account how far away you sit from the TV. A large screen doesn't always mean better definition, so text will look a bit pixelated and the colors will be optimized for watching video rather than reading. Google have some guidelines for designing for TVs that are also good console browser recommendations. So use your mobile phone as a model for the UI to simulate the experience of sitting far away from the screen. Add more blank space between elements, so use a combination of large margins and padding. Leave vertical space for content. Vertical space is at a premium on widescreen TVs, so Google recommend that you put on-screen navigational controls on the left or the right side of the screen and say vertical space for content. Finally, provide highly obvious feedback on focus to make it clear what's happening on the screen. So they suggest expanding the size of an element when a user hovers over it, and avoid drag and drop completely because it's too fiddly to control. They also note that unlike computers, users expect sound from a TV and they don't find it disruptive. The terms that we currently use to describe technology are ambiguous. So we've used the term mobile for years to mean a smartphone, but if we're talking about portability, we could include a lot of devices, like the Wii U's Gamepad, which is kind of portable, but it only works in range of a TV, or Google Glass, which is mobile, but it doesn't have a conventional screen. It's convenient to talk about devices in this way, but we've got to be careful not to pigeonhole, because it's getting hard to draw the line between things like tablet, mobile, and desktop. So this is the Samsung Galaxy camera. I saw it at the airport on the way here. It runs on Android, Jelly Bean, and it's got a browser. So this is one of a whole range of smart devices running Android, including the Nikon S800C and the Polaroid IM1836. And you can find browsers on printers now. Basically, anywhere you can stick a screen, eventually there will be a browser. When faced by all these devices, the thing that makes most sense to me is to design in a way that works for a range of different contexts. So this is a BBC homepage on the Wii U, and it's really easy to navigate using lots of different inputs, like D-pad, gesture, and touch. But remember that making one experience easier for some people might make it harder for others. So this is a keyboard on the Xbox, which is better, but still very slow using the analog stick. They've spaced the letters far apart to reduce mistakes, which is great for touch or gesture, but with an analog stick, it takes a long time to traverse from one letter to the next. And for some reason, they don't let you use a D-pad. Plan from the very start how what you're designing is going to work on different devices. Not just layout, but whether the color scheme is high contrast enough for low resolution screens, whether any fallback fonts you've chosen will be readable. And an example of a site that does that really well is the A List Apart site. Articles are in single column and the text is big, so it's readable from a distance. When I worked on the University of Surrey website, I had a chat with the designer about game console browsers, and we went through some of the things that would make it easier to navigate the site on a console browser. It was a topic that I brought up a couple of times. How would you use this on a D-pad? But it was more an accessibility thing, because most of the things that makes browsing a website easier on a console also make it easier for everyone in general. And we didn't do anything special for the console browser users. I didn't feel like we needed to, as long as our focus was to make the design as inclusive as possible. And the same with the speaker site. We just concentrated on making it as easy to use as possible. I think the console browser research did influence how it was designed, but again, I don't think we really did anything special. For every project, I create a front-end style guide, which is a deliverable, as well as a quick way of testing things across multiple devices. It contains all the different components and styles on the site, with descriptions of where it's appropriate to use them. So here I forked a version of Paul Robert Lloyd's pattern primer. And this pulls in all the code snippets from a folder and outputs a markup alongside. I can even add usage notes. This is perfect for testing, because it's just one page with all the components on it, and I can just bring up them all on the devices and scroll down to see what's broken. During the design stage, we prototype, test, and iterate little and often, and we keep doing it. And it's really important to test on real devices, because you can learn a lot from how it feels in your hands and how the colors and text look. I also work with a designer to keep track of all the colors used and to give them appropriate names, which I used as Sass variables. When it comes to client work, I very rarely mention game consoles. A lot of console browsers are designed to work already with websites, and we shouldn't have to do anything that special for them just to work. But an exception is video sites. So in this example, it makes total sense for a TV network to fully support the PlayStation browser. One of the main things that people use their consoles for, other than playing games, is watching video, things like TV catch-up services, particularly things like BBC iPlayer. So they're going to need to do a lot more testing on consoles. Think about how someone is going to use your site on a touchscreen with a D-pad, using analog sticks, or using a crazy annoying Wiimote. It will help make the game console experience better, but it will also prepare you for future weird devices. And let's not forget smart TVs. So Jason Grigsby is doing a massive amount of research into this. Using a TV remote to browse is incredibly fiddly. Some come with trackpads, but the experience is still not great, because most sites have been designed for mouse users. A lot of the problems that smart TV users face are the same as console users. Conventional controllers are changing in ways that help make activities like browsing the web easier. So the new PS4 controller will have a trackpad front and center. And some people buy keyboards or chat pads to help them type, which they clip onto a controller. And there are a few things that different sites have done to make the TV experience less painful, like YouTube. If they detect that you're using a TV, they offer you a URL to type into your phone so that you can use the phone to control what's on the screen. It's kind of like having a Wii U gamepad. Vimeo has something called couch mode, which is a button that you press that changes the interface, making it more suitable for a big screen. And I really like this because it gives that option not just to TV users, but to people who want to view this on smaller screens. And of course, Xbox have their app for Android and iOS called Smart Glass that lets you use your phone as a keypad or trackpad for the Xbox. It's also interesting to note that all three major players have second screens available for their consoles. So the PS3 can connect with a handheld PS Vita and allow the user to play games on the device directly from the PS3 console via Vita Remote Play. It can also be used as a second controller. And the Wii U has its gamepad, and the Xbox has Smart Glass. So now there's the possibility of a user viewing a site on a TV while interacting with it on a second screen device. It feels like we've only just got to grips with mobile and tablets, but this is just a fraction of the web, and we need to start exploring more of the other devices out there. If you're only designing for mobile, tablet, and desktop, you're not considering a whole mass of devices in between, and it's only going to get weirder. Console browsers live in an uncomfortable area between mobile and tablet, desktop, and TV. They often act like mobile and desktop browsers, but the way that we interact with them is so very different. But it's not about testing your website on every device there is. It's about understanding the diversity and reacting accordingly. So thinking about the whole spectrum of ways that people will interact with your site and planning how to make that experience better. I think that's all I've got time for, but if you're interested in learning more about this, have a look at the links on the resources section of my console site, and I'll be putting a link to my slides up there too.
Anna, that was a fantastic, fantastic talk. Loved it. And there was a ton of great questions. But first off, before we get to the questions, I wanted to thank you on behalf of everybody here for giving us a legitimate reason to go and get game consoles for research as a business expense. I think I did it. That was my biggest takeaway personally. I'm not sure where to start because there were so many things that were thrown out that were really interesting. But like, okay, so one of the things that kind of came up while you were talking, and I think you kind of got towards this with some of the stuff you were discussing. You can't really target it, right, with user agent detection. You can't necessarily target screen size is completely oblivious to it. Feature detection can only get you so far on some of these things. So, but you're not really saying to optimize specifically for these devices, except in particular cases. You're saying it actually just reinforces that we build better stuff, right? I mean, that's what it boils down to with the focus styles and things like that.
I think that's all we can do. And I think it's what the console makers want us to do, because they've added in all these features that make using a normal website a lot easier. But there are things that we can do to make that easier generally.
Yeah, so it gets back to the smarter default thing that appears to be a recurring theme so far, which makes a lot of sense. One of the questions that actually came from somebody who is not at the conference, but in response to something that was tweeted out that was related, and I think that, again, it's kind of tied into that, is they were saying, well, you know, how does this compare to a situation where, you know, developers were advocating, to some extent, not fully supporting like older versions of IE and stuff like that because of their market share. But on some sites, potentially that market share is going to be a little higher than this, right? But again, you're not talking optimizing for those. Yeah,
just make it easier generally. I mean, console browsers, they're kind of like they're like a torture test because they're going to show you the most extreme version of the way that your site is going to be interacted with. So it's good to test them on that. And consider them because that's what people are going to be using in the future.
And I think that that's one of the things that I really like. It's a device that I don't think any of us were really thinking about. You know, I mean, we're focused so much on on the mobile stuff. You know, the tablets that are coming out, the whole phablet thing, right? So these are the fonsoles. Don't use that, please. Don't use that. If that leaves this room, then we're in trouble. No, it's another device that came out of nowhere where we were kind of focusing on these other things, and it kind of blows away this whole mindset that we tend to have that we can target these specific devices using these different varieties, and it kind of reinforces the need for things like progressive enhancement and some responsive design aspects and things like that. For the zooming, does that, on the consoles, does that work in the similar way as the mobile with the viewport, user scalable stuff?
It really depends on the console.
Okay.
They all work very different ways. Like the XLDS devices, they kind of do the text wrapping, and others will zoom in where you're looking, others will just zoom in a section. It really varies between, there's so many different kind of types of browser on different types of the consoles. So
yeah, I mean, we got a hint of it with the dual screen zoomed out on one and zoomed in on the
other.
Yeah,
and you've got like NetFront browsers and NetFront browsers based on WebKit and Opera browsers, different versions of them. So it's quite hard to kind of nail down.
Are they Opera browsers? Are those like older versions?
Yeah, so it's Opera 8 and 9.
And do the consoles get like browser upgrades, or is it do you need new hardware or OS?
They do it with the software up-to-date. So the PS Vita that has regular software updates, and that's gone from being a really sort of poor standard supporting browser to a really good one.
So is it similar to like Android upgrades from like a 2.3 to whatever?
Yeah,
else?
yeah.
It's nice. It's similar behavior. Okay.
It's what happens every time you turn your console and you're ready to play a game, and it's just like installing updates.
And you kind of got to it with a little bit with like the remote stuff in particular, but like one of the things that's kind of interesting is with smart glass and with things like that, the dual screen experience that is starting to become a big piece, right? Like, what do we do with that?
Yeah, I mean, the Wii U is interesting because it mirrors everything that's on the screen, so you can't serve up a different design, even though it's a very different experience having it right close to your face and having it really far away. You know, the only thing you can do is just do the best you can and make an experience that's good for both situations.
And I suspect it's probably too much to hope for to have WebSocket support to be able to like do some cool interactions between the two.
Yeah.
Oh, can you on some of them?
Well, there's a Nintendo Web Framework. They're coming up with some cool stuff, but you can do some really cool things where you can target the different controllers and
Oh, interesting. Because yeah, because you see occasionally like the site. There's like a few. There's not many, but a few that like you can watch the video on the desktop or something and control the playback from your phone and things like that.
Yeah, there is something that I think there's a sort of version of Smart Glass. I was just looking at that the other day. Microsoft have some code that you can play with.
That's pretty awesome. For things like the gesture stuff, there's no way to detect that, right? Like, there's no feature detection yet for any sort of gesture thing because we don't have anything there, right?
Yeah, I mean, you have to target it specifically to the device. So with the Kinect, you can detect gesture, like with, I think it was Kinect.js. That lets you sort of play with the gestures that people are
Is that a piece of user agent detection, basically, that they're using for that then? Yeah. Sometimes that's the only option for things like that.
Yeah, I mean, for enhancements, or if you're making a game or something, you know, experimentation, I think.
But again, it comes back to everything that you've been advocating is just better development from the base, and those kinds of things aren't the way to silo experiences, but a way to kind of build up from what you've got.
Because you're going to be constantly playing catch-up.
Right. Makes a lot of sense. So thanks, Anna. I think John is just about ready to go. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.